From the outside looking in, Northern Ireland looks like any other European country. With pubs, churches, and small town shops lining the streets, you'll encounter many smiling faces. However, behind this facade lays a society of deeply rooted tribulations.
This is when nationalism started to turn round and ask the direct question to the British government that if you look upon us as British subjects, if we are governed as British citizens, if we live in the north of Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom, why are we being treated differently to any other citizen throughout the whole of the United Kingdom? Because when you talk about civil rights is not a race issue. Civil rights is not a religious issue. Civil rights affects everybody. So living here in the north of Ireland, it didn't matter whether you were Catholic, Protestant, black or white. We were part of the United Kingdom. We had the same fundamental and democratic right to be treated like any other citizen. And basically, that's what the demand was. For Ulster Unionism, who controlled the north of Ireland, well, they seen civil rights as a threat.
The Catholics seen what Martin Luther King was doing with his civil rights movement. So they set up a civil rights movement here. They had their first march on the 5th of October 1968 in Derry, or Londonderry. And that's the date historians are given for the start of the Troubles, the 5th of October 1968.
One of the problems in Northern Ireland is that Protestants do not want to know what Catholicism is. It's fear, it's ignorance. And Catholics don't want to know what the Protestant.
The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines intern as this: to confine or impound, especially during a war. Note that this confinement was usually implemented without fair trial. As with many other campaigns for human rights, people have been charged and convicted of civil disobedience before and during the Troubles. These charges came from their involvement in the first protests of this civil rights campaign. Even those found guilty did not spend time in prison up until 1968. For the next 2 years, many who were involved in certain activities related to civil rights were imprisoned. Within this time, the imprisoned person was usually released in less than a year. As the issues escalated in the campaign, both sides became more violent. Each time the other side retaliated against one, the conditions seemed to worsen. Within a year, charges went from involvement in protests and sit-in riots to violence including bombings and shootings. People were also charged for being a part of illegal organizations. Prisoners often went through different kinds of abuse during internment. There were 5 well-known techniques of abuse that were used on detainees. The first of these 5 was wall standing, a torture in which a prisoner had to stand in a stressed position for many hours. In the stressed position, a person must stand spread-eagled against a wall, with their fingers put high above their heads and their legs spread apart, their feet pushed back. This position caused the majority of the body weight to be applied to their fingers. The second technique was hooding. In hooding, a black or dark blue colored bag was placed over their head and was kept there through interrogations. The third technique took place before interrogations. During this third torture, prisoners were subjected to mass amounts of noise in a room. The noises were usually continuous and loud. Some even sounded like hissing sounds. The last two techniques involved depriving prisoners of daily needs. Before interrogations, prisoners were not allowed to sleep and they were put on a very limited diet. There were numerous other torture methods that the prisoners had to endure. While physical pain was used regularly in torture, mind games seemed to be the favored torture method.
In 1972, imprisoned members of the Irish Republican Army were granted political status and were treated as prisoners of war.
We were looked upon and treated as political prisoners. We had segregation. We didn't have to do prison work. We didn't have to do prison anything. We wore our own clothes. So we were looked upon and treated as POWs. We carried on like any other POWs. We had our command structure. We had the prison structure set up. Was set up for everybody and not just to isolate individuals. So everything was sat down was worked out for everybody, but everybody was an equal.
4 years later, in 1976, this special category status was removed by the government. Anyone convicted of terrorism-related crime after March 1st of that year was treated as an ordinary criminal. They were imprisoned in the new purpose-built H blocks of the Maze prison and had to wear prison uniforms and do prison work. In response to the removal of the prisoner's special category status, Republican prisoner Kieran Nugent refused to put on a prison uniform on September 14, 1976. He was stripped of his clothing and chose to wear only a blanket during the prisoner exercise period. This was the start of what would be known as the blanket protest. Additional prisoners began to follow suit and also refused to wear their uniforms. Eventually, the protesters were ordered to leave their blanket in their cell during the exercise period and were required to wear a uniform if they were going to leave their cells. But again, they refused. Consequently, protesting prisoners were forced to stay inside their cell 24 hours a day. When the IRA began assassinating prison guards, relations inside the prisons became very tense. Prison officers began attacking the incarcerated members. To prevent from being attacked any further, Republican prisoners launched the No Wash protest in March of 1978. During this protest, prisoners refused to leave their cells for any reason, including to shower and empty their chamber pots. Instead, they began to spread their excrement on the walls in their cells. In October of 1980, certain IRA members started a hunger strike. This strike was used to try and convince the new Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, to restore political status and the benefits that came with it. When it seemed like the government was preparing a compromise, the hunger strike of 1980 ended. Not even a month after ending the first hunger strike, the prisoners realized that the government had not implemented the compromise that they had supposedly created. On March 1, 1981, Bobby Sands decided to take action against the failed promises and began refusing food. Many other irritated prisoners also joined the cause and rejected the meals that they were given. 217 days after the second hunger strike had begun, Northern Ireland Secretary James Pryor announced that the prisoners could wear their own clothes and that remission lost would be restored. No formal recognition was ever made of their right to political status. Margaret Thatcher is still viewed as a British hero for standing her ground and not giving in to the demands of the Republican Party.
Then one cold October's morning, trapped in a lion's den, I found myself in prison once again. I was committed to the H blocks for 14 years or more. On the blanket, their conditions, they were poor. Then a hunger strike we did commence for the dignity of man. But it seemed to me that no one gave a damn. But now I am a saddened man. I've watched my comrades die. If only people cared or wondered why. And you dare to call me a terrorist while you look down your gun. When I think of all the deeds that you had done. You had plundered many nations, divided many lands. You had terrorized their peoples. You ruled with an iron hand, and you brought this reign of terror to my land.
The peace process ultimately began within prison walls during the 70s. According to political prisoners in the peacemaking process, the case of Northern Ireland, peacemaking refers to political and diplomatic efforts to bring together opponents and leaders of conflicting parties to negotiate an agreement or a settlement that would facilitate structures and workable formulas such as peace agreements to end violence. Although the prisons were a place of conflict and unrest, this was a place where prisoners could reflect on their involvement in all the conflict and question if it was valuable or not. During transitional times, many prisoners worked to find peaceful resolutions to their problems. When the official peace talks began in the 1990s, the prisoner groups played an extremely important role in the support of political leadership and in negotiating the peace process. These prisoners were greatly respected by their peers because they were looked at as people who stood up for their beliefs and what they believed to be right. Internal consultations among the prisoners added momentum to the diplomatic process as well as added legitimacy to everything that was being done within the prisons.
By the time the peace process came around here in 1998, when you see loyalists that were getting released from the jails, you had loyalists walking out and pumping iron before they could come out. But when you looked at them, yeah, big and scary looking. Mentally, they had brains this size. When you seen Republicans walking out, they were all walking out like bean poles, but they had brains this size. They knew what lay ahead. You look at government today, or I can look at government today, I can see a considerable amount of government ministers that are ex-comrades of mine. We knew what lay ahead. We knew there was a massive transition from conflict to politics, and we prepared and readied ourselves for that decision.
From our personal experiences, it is clear that some bitterness still remains within some of the communities in Northern Ireland.
During our free time, we were able to talk with a wide variety of locals. We had talked to some younger individuals who had no opinion on the Troubles.
The people from our generation seem to vary in opinions. Some believe that the Troubles are over, or that the issue is not relevant enough to be involved in, while others had strong opinions about one side or the other.
One individual that we were able to converse with had a very strong loyalist background. He served in the Royal Army. He was also raised by a father who was in a loyalist paramilitary during the Troubles. Yet he had very little knowledge about the struggles that the Republicans have to deal with.
The older generation that lived through the Troubles have a hard time accepting and giving forgiveness, but look forward to a brighter future for their children.
There were a few in the older generation that think people need to learn to accept the differences of opinions so that there can be a progress in the peace process.
In the end, both sides need to be able to reach across the divide to find peace and forgiveness in the future.
In 1821, Northern Ireland was 70% Protestant and 30% Catholic. The last census that was taken in 2011, the numbers were 52% Protestant and 48% Catholic. When the next census is taken in 2021, they're expecting Catholics to be in the majority for the first time in Northern Ireland. So they are. Now, you all know who Sinn Féin are? It's written into the Good Friday Agreement that Sinn Féin can ask for a referendum to unite Ireland. When the Catholics become the majority, Sinn Féin will be asking for that referendum. They've already mentioned it, so they have. When that comes, it's expected that the Catholics in Northern Ireland will vote to join the South of Ireland and unite Ireland. I'm sure one of you will ask me, are the troubles over? No, they're not. When that referendum comes, the Protestants, they won't be happy.
And those who lie behind me, may your courage be the same. And I pray to God my life is not in